Welcome to another edition of Toplines and Tales. Continuing with our series about the Continentals, this week we look at the origins and early imports of the Belgian Blue cattle breed in UK, a breed that originated in upper and central Belgium. I'm delighted to have on the show this week a man who could be deemed as wholly responsible for the breed being in Britain, Mister Belgian Blue himself, Tom Ashton, and we're also joined by his daughter, Helen. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
And Tom, the Belgian Blue cattle were bred up from the Shorthorn, is that right? Possibly using the Frisian, would that be correct?
I'm not sure so much about the Frisian, except that they have a blue, so you imagine there was some Frisian blood in the local cattle. The Belgian Blue came out of Durham, and especially from after the Second World War, the selection for meat increased.
But they started out as a dual-purpose breed, is that right? They were, I suppose, the Shorthorn was a dual-purpose breed too, wasn't it? And they carried on milking them. They still milk them now, I think. They certainly carried on milking them well into the 70s.
We first started going over to buy cattle. They all milk them.
But obviously they're renowned for their doubled muscling, and in Belgium this was concentrated, I think, by line breeding in the 60s. And was there one particular person or a few particular people that were involved in this concentration of building this double muscle up, Tom?
Well, it was Dr. Ansay, who was at Liège University, and he studied it and increased the muscling power. It started with one cow. I can't give you its name, and it was its son that they line bred from.
Okay, and we've looked at a lot of breeders in the last few months on this podcast, and there's a recurring theme that they use line breeding to fix these traits, so that's quite understandable that they developed the muscle into where it got, and it did become, and still is, the most extreme muscled breed in the world, isn't it?
Yes.
Tom, let's go back to your early days. You farmed from a young age, I think, and then you became a butcher. How did that come about, Tom? You had a shop, didn't you, on the farm?
Yes, my father used to send me to the cattle market every week with a couple of fat cattle to sell. And a big wholesale butcher took a shine to me, I suppose. He taught me a lot and explained that I'd make more money selling the actual meat to the public than what I would selling it to the cattle market. And he taught me how to butcher. And from that, I had about 30 butchers work for me.
And you'd supply wholesale as well, I suppose, back then,
Yeah.
did you? Yourself and your late wife, Margaret, first saw the Belgian Blue cattle in Paris in the late 70s, I think, and you just instantly saw the future, didn't you?
Yes, we've been to the Paris Agricultural Show, and we've been all day walking around. Tremendous show it is. And we're all day walking around the show, and we're just making, about 4 o'clock, we're making to come in and have a rest before we go out night clubbing in the evening. We're in Paris, you see.
Of course.
We're just coming out, and we got parted from each other, how you do in a crowd on a doorway, and I'm looking up for her, and she's looking up for me, and we saw the cattle, and we looked at each other and nodded. And that was it. It was the next thing was go the following day and organise an importation.
Wow, just a light came on there and then. Yeah. And there was a problem, I think, originally with the shipping the cattle in, wasn't it, to do with the health status or issues with the health status around them in Belgium?
The amount of work that my wife put into importing them, we had to quarantine them at both ends. I forget how many weeks it was for. It was quite a lot. And we couldn't bring them until they'd passed this quarantine. Well, it made it very difficult to import them. They hadn't to be vaccinated for foot and mouth. But the chain herd, and it was the best effort we'd seen. And we explained to the man that he mustn't vaccinate it or we couldn't buy it. The first thing he did when we went out of the yard was vaccinate it. He thought we meant vaccinate it.
Your French wasn't good enough, possibly. Ah, dear, and that's one that got away. But there were a few issues. I know there were with bringing cattle in from Europe, but I think certainly it hampered you to start with. But you selected some females as well as a bull, but you were looking for the extreme muscled types then, Tom, as a butcher. I suppose you were looking at the killing out percentage, were you?
Correct. We wanted semen. We only wanted one heifer. But we had to have a bull because we'd no bull in England and we couldn't import semen.
No, there was an issue around bringing the semen in for a while, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Just going back to the cattle there and the double muscling, they did have a reputation for difficult calving, didn't they? And you'll have seen that with the cesareans, and a lot of the breeders used to do the cesareans themselves on the farms. Did that not worry you in any way at the time?
No, the Belgians would sometimes do a cesarean themselves, but it wasn't always necessary. They did it because they were experts at it and it was easier. We very little trouble. Sometimes you could have a difficult calf in it if you had pedigree on pedigree, but when we put pedigree on commercial cattle, with no problems at all.
Sure, and some of that will depend on the bulls. And going back to that first import, I think the cow, Debutante du Morage, exceptionally well named, being Debutante because she was the first one in, but she was probably the pick of those cows, wasn't she, Tom?
Yes, we were very, very lucky. They didn't all produce, but she not only produced quality, she produced quantity of embryos.
And the bull, of course, was Lulu, and Lulu and Debutante clicked together, didn't they? And as you said, you bred a lot of cows by E.T., and I looked her up, Tom. She bred 119 progeny.
Some going, yes.
And tell me about Lulu then. He went into AI, didn't he? And you being based in Cheshire, I guess your main purpose would be selling semen to the dairy herds, wouldn't it?
That's what we were doing, yes. And all the cows, with him being white, were coming blue and white. We found that the dairy farmer didn't want dark blue ones. They wanted like the whitish calves. But what we found was that if a suttlerman came, we told him that the best cattle for suttlers was the blue ones. Until this day, the suttlerman asked for the coloured ones.
Because they're the ones that you couldn't sell to the dairyman. Well, that's a smart move, Tom. There's no flies on you. Going back to Lulu, I took a Lulu calf from a guy called Paul Boston in Bridgnorth to Smithfield in 1983, and he was the very first calf born off of Lulu in the UK, I think, and he was certainly the first Belgian Blue in Smithfield, and he was out of a dairy, but he was a bloody good calf.
Yes.
And under 9 months, he came third, I think, in the open continental calf class, and he was giving away about 80 kilos. It's not a bad start, and a pretty good advert for Lulu that day, I think.
Yes, that's correct.
And Lulu went on to sire 669 pedigree Belgian Blue calves in the UK.
Yes, he would do.
There was a lot of owners in there as well, wasn't there?
Yes.
The rose shows. And
he did a tremendous job, Lulu. And there again, you're one pick. If you don't get a good one first time, you're snookered. We couldn't get anybody to buy a bull after the first import, and we needed one for Lulu's calves. And I had to buy Gavroche.
I was going to say, you started taking orders, I think, for a few more imports, didn't you? But you brought another bull in, and that was Gavroche, and again, a beast that did a great lot of good.
He was from the same herd as Debutante, wasn't he?
Yes.
And then yourself, Margaret, and Helen, for that matter, started the UK Belgian Blue Breed Society, and that was run, I think, at Lawn's Farm at the time, wasn't it?
Yes.
And who would the early breeders be in there on that list then? Who else apart from yourselves?
So there was George Graham and Brian Weston. They were the very first.
The minutes from the 1984 meeting, you've got yourself, Margaret, my mum, Mashiter,
John Mashiter.
Richard Eads from Chelford,
Yes,
George Graham and Brian Weston.
that's right.
And didn't you have to have a certain number of people before you could form a herd book? Is there some sort of rules on that, wasn't there?
Yes, and with a job to get the numbers up.
7, wasn't
I
it?
think it was 7.
And then they moved on. Your first secretary, I remember him, can't remember, David Brettle, that's right, yes.
He was given us by Chelford. Chelford were very kind to us.
Going to mention that Chelford Market became the centre for Belgian Blues for some reasons, and for our overseas listener, it's about 20 miles south of Manchester, and the first sale was there, and the cattle from there went far and wide. But as you said, it was they were good to you, but you were good to them as well. We
wanted a valuation on the cattle, what we were breeding, so I put a calf, I don't know what, 8 or 10 weeks old, bull calf, a full-grown bull ready for work, which was Ambrose, and a heifer about 12 months old, up for auction at Marshall's at Chelford, 1983. and they sold well. People started getting interested in them then.
Fortunately for yourself, it wasn't possible for people to import semen, so you started to shift a lot of semen through the Milk Marketing Board, I think, to start with, who are an independent government-owned organisation, aren't they?
Yes.
You had a lot of problems getting them to accept them, though, didn't you?
Yes. At the beginning, Keith Cook of the Milk Board, he said to my wife, your husband's doing a great disservice to the British beef industry, taking these cattle in. So then, when we've been going a little while, he went to my wife and he said, your Tom's doing a great service to the British beef industry, because he could see that they were calving without any trouble. And there was an Italian breed that the Milk Board had. They thought would be easy calving, but they weren't.
I think that'll be the Chianina breed that we talked about on a previous podcast. And as we do on this series, let's go on and talk about some of those early bulls that stamped the breed. And we've mentioned embryos from Lulu and Debutante, and you just mentioned Lawrence Ambrose. Was he one of those? Was he a Lulu Debutante cross?
Yes, he was, and him and Dominic, until quite recently, were amongst the leading bulls in the breed.
I remember Dominic, yes, you're right, he's still in a lot of pedigrees today, isn't he?
I can remember showing Dominic at the Royal Show, and I didn't really know what I was doing, and I'd only shown in pedigree classes, and you put me in, I think, was it MLC 400-day growth class or something?
That's right, yes.
And we went in that at the Royal Show. We didn't win, but I think we came third. But I know Dominic's 400-day weight was 672 kilos, wasn't it? Which was one of the best we ever had.
Big weight back then. It's still a big weight today, to be honest.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the Royal Show. I think in 1983, Tom, you had cattle on a demonstration stand there, didn't you? But it was a bit longer before you could get the classes for them. But you must have done some good from that. We
took round all the Royal Shows the first year that we had them. We took the cattle. And what we did, we were too late to enter or hire a stand. So we approached people that were selling anything to allow us to put our animal on their stand. And we would advertise that the Belgian Blue would be on stand number 46 or whatever. And it worked out, and they got more customers selling gates or whatever they were selling. And we got a stand the first year, which we'd have had to wait another year otherwise.
Great idea.
First year. Was it 3 heifers you took?
Yes, to the Royal.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we'd never shown cattle before. And when they got there, they were very dirty. And we noticed everybody else's were clean. And we didn't know what to do. And you found a chap called Bob Powell, didn't you?
Yes.
He helped us out and cleaned them up for us.
Bob Powell was a legend of a man and always willing to help everybody. That's great. And it was a few years later before the Royal Show had classes for them. And even then, I remember it well, we were all out in a marquee because there wasn't room for them in the building, or they didn't want them in the main building.
That's right.
We got the crowd there, though, didn't we?
Yes.
Some of those early cow classes were spectacular, weren't they? Some of these first cows that came in, but they were buggers to show. As Helen said, you hadn't shown them before, and I was reasonably experienced at showing cattle by the time I got to the Belgian Blues, but they were hard to show because in Belgium they show them with their heads down, whereas in the UK, of course, or everywhere else, we like to show them with their heads up, and there's such strong, heavy neck muscles on them, it was almost impossible to get the heads up.
Yeah, they didn't want their heads up. When they came to judge, he would be wanting the heads up, and they didn't want to go up. But in Belgium, they shoved them down all the time.
I remember showing one, and I can't remember where it was, trying to lift his head up, and the Belgian came along and he hit his head on a stick and said, "Put that head down." He hit it on the head with a stick, and in fact I think my shoulder's probably still not right to this day trying to hold those animals up. But Helen, I remember it became fun. You had a cow called Jasmine. She was a fantastic show cow, and I had Fifi de Saint Fontaine. She was up over a ton, and there were some great cows in those classes, weren't there?
We did. Yes. We had some fun showing those at the time, didn't we? Jasmine, I don't think that she was one of the best cows we had, and she wasn't one of the best breeders either, but gosh, she had a lot of sparkle in the show ring, and that made up for everything. We had some fun taking her all over the country in the Bedford TK, and I used to sleep upstairs in the Luton, and Mum and Dad used to come along when it had been washed and we were just going into the show ring. But yes, no, Jasmine was a good cow to show. But I remember, was it Ron Collins that had your Fifi?
Yes.
Did Pauline have it later on? Or
Pauline, they bought it off Pauline. I think Joe and Pauline may have imported her, and she was Fifi. She was a Saint-Fontaine, and then Ron bought them from there. I think she was probably never a great breeder, but she was a great show-cow.
Well, I went to Saint-Fontaine herd quite often, and they were milking into the early 90s, and they had an old grandma there that used to make jams from the fruit trees in the garden, and we used to always get served lovely jam, didn't we?
Yes.
Going back to that show, that same year that we had Fifi, I had another cow from Ron Collins. She was a mad bloody thing. I can't remember her name. We went round the Grand Parade and she took off, and I think I grass skied around the whole main ring on the back of my heels, and eventually I hauled her up and tied her to a post, and then she took off again, took the post with her as well. So, but they were a very docile breed. They still are a very docile breed, aren't they?
Yeah. I remember showing Lawns another debutante at the Royal.
She was a good cow.
I think that was 88. She was a tremendous cow, but she hadn't got any style or presence at all. And I don't know who was judging, but the Belgians came to us as we were getting it ready, and they said, give it a bottle of Guinness and put an onion up its bum, and bring it round, but it didn't do anything, did it?
Are you sure you didn't put the onion up the bum, the one I was leading? Maybe that's why she took her around the Grand Parade. But Tom, you were still at this time the only man to bring these cattle in, and were for quite a while. And how did you control that, Tom? Did you sort of? I mean, I know you drew straws in quarantine, sort of through the society, but you had a hold on the breed for a while.
Yes, I don't know how really. We just started the society, and my wife ran it, and you're looking at a different thing than what we were then. Then it was nearly impossible for anybody to import. It was only when we got going that it was possible for anybody to import, because they released the import law.
Was this because they were coming through Belgium, or would this be the same with because the French Charolais boys and limousines they'd be bringing cattle in that time, wouldn't they?
I presume so. I don't know anything about them, but it was difficult for us to get them out into England.
And as I mentioned, the cattle went into quarantine, and the early ones, didn't you draw straws for them to sort of pick which ones they wanted?
Yes, but we used to get the Belgian person who ran the quarantine to make draws for who got which.
That's a fair way of doing things. I know a few other breeds did the same thing. Let's go back and look at some of those early breeders then, and they were a motley bunch, weren't they? There were calf dealers and butchers and a lot of rogues. I think that's what endeared me to the breed, really. There were some interesting characters, weren't there?
Yes.
Yeah, Ted Hayes to be.
Ted Hayes came. He bought cattle and exported them, and he bought them in Chelford. I think it was every Monday. That's how he got to know about the Belgian Blue, through going to Chelford for calves.
Yes, he was a calf dealer, got a big calf dealer and a great character. And I've got a few more names here. There was Pip Stennett, who was larger than life character, and yes. Susan Eaton Williams, and we mentioned just now Ron the Collins, known as Ron the Con for various reasons, who was I think he'd run a garage and calf dealers and generally anything that he could turn a shilling at, but he was another character. And Joe and Pauline Adams we mentioned just now, and Michelle, Nigel Gardner, Jim Barber and Graham Brindley.
Adams, we were at the Royal Show, and Pauline and Joe came looking, and Pauline was doing the talking, and I thought, this fancy little blonde is wasting my time. There's a lot of people wanting to speak to me, and I'm more or less ignoring them, you see. And then all at once, Joe just walked across. He said, bring me 10.
Really?
he was like the biggest one of the week, but it didn't look it with Pauline doing the talking, you know.
Pauline became one of the crowd and amongst us when we were having all that fun, wasn't she, Helen? And you and her were good pals, I think.
It was, yes. It was funny because, Pauline showed some fantastic cattle, but I think the park cattle were always known for the bulls, whereas the lawns, we in later years really turned a show winning bull out. It was always the cows that and heifers that we succeeded with, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
Mm-hmm. A few more names in there I mentioned, Janet and John Green and one or two, and they were good crowds. I'm going to tell a story. I remember I probably was the first one to instigate a little bit of hybrid crossbreeding in the cattle world at the Stafford County Show. And I had a bull called Park Chaos, and bred by Pauline and owned by Ron Collins. And he broke his halter in the middle of the night and he would have served pretty well most of the Simmentals in the building. They weren't all bulling at the time, but they're tied up, so he had them anyway, I think. He went on a rampage that night. I even went to Australia with the breed. Ron Collins took 4 heifers and a bull. Unfortunately, the bull only had 3 good legs, so it wasn't exactly an easy sell when those Aussies expect a bull to walk 100 miles to serve a cow. This thing was lucky to walk to the nearest feed trough. So.
Well, in 1986, I went to Australia, New Zealand, and the US. And saw quite a lot of Gavroche semen, didn't we?
Yes.
Going round the shows there at the time. So perhaps laid the foundations for mine and yours pedigrees going over.
You will have done, of course. And I think it was 89 when we went there, and within a few weeks of them landing, they closed the door to all UK imports because of BSE. So right. Ron got the bull into an AI station, and he absolutely cleaned up over there with his 3-legged bull. So I can't remember his name, but if he's knocking about in a few of the pedigrees there, don't blame me on that one. And the breed moved on fast after that, didn't it? And to start with, a few people dissed them as they weren't all great on their legs, but and they had a few other problems as well. I won Banbury Fatstock in 1985 with a cracking Belgian Blue Cross heifer, and she had a short jaw, and there was an issue with some of those as well. I think. Any idea why that was?
Well, I don't know where it was from, but as soon as I found out that there were certain problems, I employed Joe Noble. Joe had been the licensing officer for our government, and he'd retired. So he then worked for the Belgian Blue Society, and a bull had to be licensed by Joe before it could be used for pedigree breeding.
Great idea.
And likewise with the legs. And we had a system of marking that for imports, we only brought grade 3, the middle one, for the jaw.
Okay, that clears that up. Thank you, because I did remember that one from her. And then you're talking about you got experienced people to vet the cattle, but also some experienced cattlemen came into the breed, didn't they, and changed them into the more of a bull that the suckler herd wanted. The likes of Jim Barber, Danny Wiley, and a few other showmen got involved, and Bart as well, Richard Bartle. These guys had been in a lot of breeds before they got to the Blues, and they corrected the legs on a lot of them, didn't they?
Yes.
And then, Tom, you were chairman of the society for a long time, I think nearly a decade maybe.
He kept saying do another year, and when I had 10 years at it, and it was a hell of a lot of work early on. In fact, I couldn't have done it without my wife doing a lot of it. Anyway, I decided 10 years was enough, so I was going to announce it at the AGM. And Clive Gordon jumped up. He said, "Before you start the meeting," he said, "I have a proposition." I said, "Yeah, what's the proposition?" He said, "We want you to stay on another year." And he did 11 years.
You did 11, yeah. And then you judged, of course, Tom, it would be a full-time job. You judged all over the country, and you judged in Brussels, I believe. Wouldn't be many people that had judged the Blues in Brussels, for sure?
Oh, I've judged it in Lens and in Brussels. I think I'm the only Englishman ever to judge in Brussels, yeah.
And you judged in Kansas, Tom?
Correct. The biggest show I ever judged was in Ireland. God, I forget how much the prize money was. It was hundreds of pounds for the winner. It was a nervous job judging.
Always wore your trademark bowler hat, Tom. I can remember it well. In fact, both you and Margaret judged. Well, and you did as well, Helen, I think, didn't you? 3 of you all.
Yeah.
Yes, my bowler hat. In America, they were all on about my bowler hat. I said, "You have your cowboy hat, don't you?" And I said, "This is my uniform."
And Tom, there was something about you giving a piece of beef to Mrs. Thatcher. What's that all about?
She was in Downing Street, and it was to do with France, trying to draw us into the common market. And I made a presentation of meat to Mrs. Thatcher. I've got a letter from her stating that she'd enjoyed it.
He said there was enough to feed an army, and it was delicious.
Yes.
Good for her. Good for you, for that matter. So the beef was, and still is, excellent, but it needed to be cut right, didn't it? With the Pures in Belgium, I think they stripped the muscles off in seams, didn't they, and then cut it across the grain? Is that right, Tom? You're a butcher.
It's correct. They followed, it's so long since I did one their way, but they brought it out in nice pieces for slicing up, where if we go through the double muscle on a pedigree, we tend to get it too big, for want of a better word.
Yeah, you can't get out steak off a pedigree blue without seam cutting, can you?
No.
No, and I think that's probably an issue with the people that misunderstand the way to cut them. And of course, in Central Europe, they eat leaner beef anyway. I should know, I live here, and a lot of the beef here in France is from 2-year-old cows, 3-year-old cows, and Belgium, that would be the same, wouldn't it? They'd eat these cows at 3 years old.
Yes.
And I'm told, on the beef front, I'm told the breed never really took off in the US, despite you being there in Kansas, and certainly it's not big there nowadays, and that's because they pay a premium for marbling, and I suppose that isn't the blue's strength. So some of our American listeners will not understand, what a Belgian blue is.
Yes, and there's something about America, about the pack the meat in a certain size of box, and the Belgian blue didn't fit the box.
On the meat. I remember Pete Bodley and myself at the Belgian Blue barbecue at the Royal Show, ceremoniously taking a couple of steaks round the corner to the beef shorthorn barbecue to see what they thought, and they were suitably impressed, I have to say, and then they brought us some shorthorn steaks back in return, which they may have been better. They were certainly different, but it was interesting times to be able to promote that beef right from the on the hoof to a barbecued steak, handing out to the public.
Yes.
There were some excellent barbecues at the Blue Stand at the Royal, weren't there?
They were great fun.
We had times, but I know I used to go take the cattle down to the Royal Welch Show, and you used to back your cattle trailer up, and they used to come and welcome you and help you lead your cattle off, and we helped you unload your straw. And at the Royal, they were awful to you. They didn't tell you where to go or what to do, and but the Welch made you so welcome.
And the Royal, of course, isn't there anymore, and therein hangs a tale, maybe, Helen. Going back to Pete worked for Michelle Gardner, and of course her and Nigel, they brought in a few cows themselves, didn't they, certainly in their later years. And I spoke to Pete the other day, and he mentioned the Garni de Mirage and Glorette de Bonnie Ray. Right. I think a couple of names that he mentioned, but I suppose that would be the time then that the adventurous ones would go and start sourcing their own animals, Tom.
That's right, yes. Once quarantine finished, it's not much problem bringing them. It was up at that time, with all the quarantine, that it was a big job. The
breed grew very quickly then through embryo transfer, didn't it? In fact, a few companies set up purely around the blues. There was Stella Skulls and QET. The ET was just a good way of moving the breed on, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a boost to get it promoted, because providing that your animals were good that you were ETing from, it speeded the process up a lot.
Which did you say earlier that ET came just around the time that you needed it?
Yes.
Timing couldn't have been better, Tom. And Helen, what about the other breeders? Who were the guys to beat then back then? Who were the cows? You got any other names for me? I remember Clive got it. You mentioned.
When Doug Hazel, he had Hazelwood Professional. Barry Brazier had some good show cattle. I think he enjoyed showing them more than breeding them, really. Roland Mason, he enjoyed his showing. He had Virtuose de Somme. Yeah, there was a good crowd. Jill Evans later on, Jill and Hugh Evans had some good cattle. But like you say, Michelle Gardner and Pete Bodley, Kosher, Richling Kosher was one of their better ones, wasn't it? But they had some very good cattle, and he did a good job, Pete. I think he was only a young lad when he was at first at the Royal Welsh with us.
I remember at the Royal Welsh, I had a heifer from Bassey Burns called Daisy May, and for some reason she decided to bulldoze Peter's heifer out of the ring. I think he'd maybe come first and I'd come second, so she locked down and sort of four-wheel drive bulldozed him straight over the top of the railings and in a pile on the floor, and the national television picked it up, and then we went into the pub that evening and all the Royal Welsh was on the television, and the first thing they showed was this heifer pushing Peter into the middle of the crowd. You mentioned Hazelwood Freshman. He was a great bull, and I remember him being hard to beat, and he was good on his legs, wasn't he? And he's still being used today, that bull. I know somebody that's still got straws of him, still using him.
Yeah, I never thought he was a typical Blue, really, but he was just so good and strong and correct, wasn't he?
Dark bull, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And going on to Joe and Pauline, they had Park Daimler, who was a great bull, and then Park Dominator and Park Eagle, and they had a good go, didn't they, the bulls?
They did. They specialised in the bulls. They bred some great bulls. Every show you went to, they seemed to bring a different bull out fresh, and they were all good.
Selling them each time, I guess.
Yeah.
But the genetics bred through from generation to generation, didn't they? I remember a black bull with a white head. I think his name was Gaylard, and he had a bad temper on him. And people used to say whenever you saw a Belgian Blue with a white head, that all went back to that one bull. There weren't too many blues north of the border, were there? Not to start with, anyway. Not in good hands, anyway. I think Robert Graham had a few.
It was a difficult job selling in Scotland. It was the rest of the country was into them, and they'd not heard of them in Scotland. But eventually, we got them going.
Yeah, and I said some of those Scottish guys that took them and maybe changed them to suit their ways, and within a few years the herd book had swelled into the thousands, hadn't it? And the job was going great guns. And the breed has also been consistent with putting the back ends on crossbred cattle, hasn't it? Particularly show cattle, and to this day most of the show calves they've got some blues in the female line, haven't they? Somewhere.
Yes, they have. They're the best carcass animal there is. You've just to beware that if you're breeding pedigree on pedigree, you have to mind what you're doing. You have to be careful.
I don't think there's many show cattle without a sprinkling of blue in them nowadays, is there?
Eventually they became the British Blue. When was that? Were you still involved with them then?
Well, I was asked to agree to it. It didn't really affect me that much. I contacted Belgium and they didn't mind. And it was something to do with the supermarkets. They were frightened of not selling the beef because it had been got by caesarean section. And I tried to explain that wasn't the normal procedure. It was only in a very rare case that you had a caesarean section. But that was what the supermarkets were frightened of. But they changed the name to British Blue, said that they were bred differently.
Do you remember when that was, Helen?
I would think it would be about 10 years ago, but I
don't
know.
So nowadays there's some good young guns in the breed, aren't there? There's Rob Patterson at Auchinleigh and Kevin Watlet at Solway View, young Ali Jackson bringing out the cattle. These guys have got some great correct beasts nowadays, and the breed's moved on, hasn't it? And these are cattle that would grace any breed now, aren't they? And the Belgian Blues now, of course, are scooping up interbreeds as well, which is a good endorsement for where they stand within the cattle.
It's taken a long time for them to get into the interbreeds. We used to struggle, didn't we? But now they're often up there.
As I said, the breed's changed, and it's in good hands now, that's for sure. And Tom, our paths crossed again a few years later when you imported the first Beltex sheep into the UK, again from Belgium. And for our overseas listener, a Beltex is a Belgian Texel, and again sporting the double muscle in the same way that the Belgian Blue cattle had. And you saw the potential in those, and you made another killing.
I went on a farm in Belgium to buy Belgian Blue cattle, and when we're walking amongst the cattle looking at them, I said, good God, look, they've got sheep like our cattle. And eventually I went and I had a good look at them, but you see, I'm not a sheep man. And I said, it's a pity we don't know more about sheep than we do, kind of thing, or we could import some of these. And my wife said, you are importing some, you've never been wrong yet, you won't be wrong this time. So we set about importing those, and that they were successful as well. I didn't think we'd be successful with two breeds, but we were.
You did, and you had two cracking ewe lambs on a stand at the Royal Highland Show. And my father was judging the Blue Domains at the Highland Show that year, and after the showing, he was bored and stumbled across your stand, tucked well away from the stock lines, and he came and fetched me all excited, and he said, "Come and take a look at these animals." And I wasn't totally convinced, to be fair, but he bought a pair of them off you, and he started his Cunningswick flock, to which he went on to great things with.
Uh-huh.
No, he turned some good sheep out, your dad, didn't he? I went to Belgium with him on a couple of occasions, and I can remember of an evening he used to be on his whiskey, and last thing at night he'd always say, "Bring me a glass of milk."
And Helen, of course, you were secretary of the Beltex for a long while, and very successful you were all with them.
I sort of fell into the job. I think it started in 1989, and I did it for 17 years. And it's funny because if you read the minutes from a council meeting now, 20 years almost on, the issues are the same. Ear tags, inspections, nothing ever changes with these breed societies.
You can go back 100 years and still find those same issues. Well, Tom, we thank you very much for bringing both of those. More to the point, the whole Belgian Blue breed. Thanks to you for what you and Margaret did over this last 40 years, and it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with both of you. Thank you, and I hope some people have been enlightened as to the origins of the Belgian Blue breed, and I hope we can all meet again soon and catch up with the dram.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for listening to our Toplines and Tales podcast. You may like to take a look at our Toplines and Tales Facebook page as well, where you'll find some photographs to back up this episode, as well as many more photos and discussions on similar topics.